I never thought the man who gave me life would be the one to nearly take it away in a single violent instant. My father stood across from me in the cramped living room, his face red with rage, his breath sour with whiskey, his fists clenched as though I were not his daughter but some enemy he had sworn to crush. The words I had just spoken still hung in the air between us. Simple words, words that changed everything. I said no. I refused to help him pay off his gambling debt. For 30 years, I had been his puppet, the obedient daughter who worked hard, handed over every spare dollar, sacrificed my dreams, and kept silent while he tore our family apart. But tonight, I decided enough was enough. His eyes narrowed, and before I could even process what was happening, his fist slammed into my face with a force that cracked bone and sent me crashing to the floor. Pain shot through my jaw, radiating through my skull, sharp and hot like lightning. I tasted blood, metallic and bitter, pooling on my tongue. My vision blurred as I struggled to understand what had just happened. My father towered above me, chest-heaving, nostrils flaring. Then he spat at me, his voice cold as ice. "You are dead to me." Those words cut deeper than the blow itself. They stripped away whatever fragile thread of family I still believed existed. My mother stood frozen in the corner, wringing her hands, her eyes wide but her mouth silent. She had lived under his shadow for decades, always choosing survival over confrontation. My younger brother sitting on the couch did not rush to help me either. He only shook his head with a look of contempt, muttering that I should have done what father asked, that I should not have provoked him. My heart clenched with a pain more unbearable than the throbbing in my jaw. In that moment, I realized I had no allies within the walls of my childhood home. I was bleeding, broken, humiliated, and utterly alone. The clock on the walls ticked loudly, marking each second of my humiliation as my father loomed, daring me to stand, daring me to defy him again. I pressed a trembling hand against my swollen jaw, forcing myself to rise. My legs shook, but I stood anyway, because lying on the floor like a victim was exactly what he wanted. My father smirked, satisfied with the damage he had inflicted, convinced that pain would bring me back under his control. But as I looked into his eyes filled with nothing but hatred and greed, something inside me shifted. I knew at that moment that I would never again bow to his cruelty. That punch was not the end of me, it was the beginning. He thought he had destroyed me, but he had unknowingly awakened a part of me that had been buried for years, a part that refused to be silenced, a part that would fight back. My name is Claire Thompson. I am 30 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my life has been defined not by my choices, but by the demands and violence of my father. When I lay in that hospital bed with my jaw wired shut, pain radiating through every nerve of my face, memories I had tried for years to bury came flooding back with ruthless clarity, each one reminding me that what happened in that living room was not an isolated event, but the climax of decades of abuse and control. I grew up in a small house on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, a house that looked normal from the outside with its white siding and a little swing set in the yard, but inside its walls were soaked with fear. My father, Henry Thompson, was a man whose moods changed with the bottle in his hand, gentle only when he was asleep and violent whenever the world did not bend to his will. My mother, Evelyn, had been beautiful once, with long auburn hair and a laugh that neighbors remembered from her younger days, but by the time I was 10, her hair was dull. Her back was bent from years of stress, and her laugh was something I only saw in photographs. She lived in constant survival mode, whispering warnings to me and my younger brother Michael whenever she sensed the storm in my father's eyes. Do not speak back. Do not make noise. Do not provoke him. That was the mantra of our household. I was 7 the first time I saw my father throw a glass against the wall because my mother had not cooked dinner fast enough. I was 9 when he slapped me across the face for leaving my homework on the kitchen table instead of in my room. By 12, I had learned that bruises heal faster than the shame of believing you are never enough. While other children went to sleepovers or joined soccer teams, I stayed home cleaning, cooking, and trying to keep the house quiet so my father would have no reason to explode. He controlled everything, even the smallest details of our lives, from the clothes I wore to the way I styled my hair. He would sneer at me if I smiled too brightly, accusing me of trying to attract attention and scold me if my grades were anything less than perfect, insisting that his name was attached to my performance. When I was 16, I got my first part-time job at a grocery store, proud to finally earn my own money. But when I brought home my paycheck, he snatched it from my hands and declared that in this family, money belonged to the man of the house. My mother did not intervene. She only told me quietly later that night that keeping him calm was more important than fairness. That pattern continued for years. Every cent I earned from babysitting summer jobs and later from my first real career went straight into his hands. He would gamble it away at poker nights or drown it in liquor while telling me that I should be grateful he let me live under his roof. My teenage years were filled not with dreams of college or freedom, but with strategies for survival. I became skilled at reading the subtle shifts in his tone, the way his jaw tightened when he was on edge, the signs that he had lost too much money at the casino. I knew when to disappear into my room, when to hide my brother in the backyard, when to stay silent even if every fiber of me wanted to scream. By the time I graduated high school, I had earned a scholarship to a university across the state, a chance to escape, but my father crushed that hope in a single conversation. He told me that girls did not need college, that my place was at home supporting the family, and when I cried that night, my mother held me and whispered that sometimes dreams had to be sacrificed for family duty. I obeyed, though inside me a small flame of resentment began to burn. I worked full-time at a diner, then at a small office job handing over my paychecks while watching classmates move into dorms, post photos of campus life, and build futures that seemed impossibly far from mine. My father grew bolder with every year, demanding more, belittling me whenever I hesitated, reminding me that without him, I was nothing. When I was 22, he hit me so hard I could not chew solid food for a week, all because I refused to lend him my car to go to a poker game. When I was 25, I secretly applied for a loan to move out, but when the papers arrived at the house, he found them first, tore them up in front of me, and warned that if I ever tried to leave, I would regret it. By then, my younger brother Michael had already learned to echo my father's words. He mocked me for being weak, told me I owed Dad everything, and called me selfish whenever I resisted. In his eyes, siding with our father was easier than fighting him, and so I became isolated even within my own family. At 28, I finally managed to save enough money in a hidden account at the bank, but when my father discovered it, he erupted into such fury that I ended up with a sprained wrist and a broken promise to myself. I stayed again convinced that perhaps this was the only life I would ever know. Still, there were fleeting moments when I imagined something different. Walking home from work, I would see women my age, laughing with friends, planning weddings, holding babies, and I would wonder what it might feel like to live without fear. I had never dared to voice those thoughts, not even to myself, but they lingered, small sparks that refused to die. When I turned 30, the pressure from my father escalated. His gambling debts were larger than ever, collectors calling the house, threatening to take what little we had left. He turned to me with the same expectation he always had, that I would step in and clean up his mess. For the first time, though, I felt that spark inside me flare into something stronger. I had my own job, my own tiny savings hidden again more carefully this time, and I was exhausted from 30 years of servitude. So when he demanded that I pay his debts, I finally found the courage to refuse. That refusal was the trigger for the explosion that followed, the punch that broke my jaw, the spit that marked me as dead in his eyes. But in truth, the moment I said no, a different kind of death occurred, the death of the obedient daughter he had crafted. What he did not know was that something new had been born in its place, a woman who would no longer submit, who would rather endure pain than surrender her dignity again. The night I refused to help my father with his debts was the night every illusion I had clung to about family shattered completely. I had always known deep down that he valued me less as a daughter and more as a resource. But when his fist connected with my jaw and his spit landed on my cheek when he snarled that I was dead to him, the truth was no longer something I could deny or soften with excuses. I remember struggling to breathe as the pain radiated through my skull, but worse than the pain was the sight of my mother and brother, their silence speaking louder than any words. My mother wrung her hands, tears glistening in her eyes, yet she said nothing. She did not shout at him to stop. She did not rush to my side. She simply stood there like a ghost, resigned to her fate. My brother Michael sneered from the couch, his voice sharp with accusation as he told me this was all my fault, that I should have done what Dad asked, that I had brought this on myself. The betrayal in his tone cut through me like a blade. I had sacrificed my entire youth to shield him from our father's wrath. I had worked long shifts and handed over paychecks so he could go to college classes, yet in this moment he had no loyalty to me. He had chosen the abuser over the sister who had protected him for years. My father stormed out of the room after his violent display, muttering curses about ungrateful children and promising to find another way to get the money. The house fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock. I sat on the floor with blood dripping down my chin, holding my jaw in trembling hands, looking at the two people who were supposed to love me most and realizing they saw me as expendable. Later that night, when I tried to gather my few belongings to leave, my mother stopped me at the door. Her voice shook as she begged me to reconsider, not out of concern for me, but for him. "Claire," she whispered, "you know your father has a temper. Why do you insist on provoking him? If you had just agreed to help, none of this would have happened." My heart broke in that moment more than it had under his fists, because she had chosen him again just as she had chosen him every single day for 30 years. I asked her, "What about me? What about your daughter? Do I not matter?" She looked away, unable to answer, trapped in the cage she had built for herself long ago. Michael appeared behind her, arms crossed, his eyes filled with cold judgment. He told me flatly that if I was not willing to help my own father, then I should not expect to be part of this family anymore. The words echoed the venom my father had spat at me hours earlier, confirming that in their eyes I was no longer a daughter or a sister, just a traitor who refused to pay. I stumbled out of the house into the night, the cool air stinging my bruised skin, my heart pounding with rage and despair. I made it to a friend's apartment where she urged me to go to the hospital. As I sat in the emergency room waiting for x-rays, the betrayal played on repeat in my mind, each detail sharper than the next. My father's violence was monstrous, but I had always half expected it. What crushed me was the realization that my mother and brother would rather see me beaten than see him challenged, that loyalty to the tyrant was safer than standing beside the victim. When the nurse asked how I had been injured, I opened my mouth to lie, to say I had fallen the instinct of a lifetime of silence pressing down on me. But then I caught sight of my reflection in a stainless steel tray, my swollen face, my haunted eyes, and I stopped myself. I whispered the truth for the first time. My father hit me. Saying the words felt like tearing open an old wound, but it also felt like the first step toward freedom. The doctors wired my jaw and sent me home with pain medication, but home was no longer a word that meant safety. I returned briefly to collect clothes, only to be met with cold stares and harsh words. My brother accused me of trying to destroy the family by speaking to outsiders. My mother begged me not to shame them, and my father laughed in my face, telling me no one would believe me because family always protects family. He told me that if I ever went to the police, he would make sure everyone knew I was a liar and an ingrate. His confidence came from years of getting away with everything, from knowing my silence had always protected him. But this time, something inside me refused to cower. I realized in that moment that the people who should have stood beside me had abandoned me, and if I wanted justice, I would have to carve my own path. That was when betrayal transformed into clarity. I finally saw them for who they truly were, not family, but jailers. My father was the warden, my mother, his silent accomplice. My brother, his apprentice, and I was the prisoner who had just broken her chains by saying no. The betrayal still burned, but beneath it, a stronger flame began to grow, the flame of determination. I would not only survive, I would rise, and I would make sure that the truth they tried to bury would one day bury them instead. The hospital room was dim and quiet, except for the steady hum of machines and the occasional squeak of rubber soles on the hallway floor. My jaw was wired shut, my face swollen and bruised, my body aching with every small movement. Yet it was not the physical pain that consumed me, but the clarity that came with it. For 30 years I had lived in a prison built by my father's fists and my mother's silence. I had endured humiliation, sacrifice, and the constant reminder that I existed only to serve the man who called himself my father. But as I lay there, unable to speak my thoughts sharper than they had ever been, I understood something that changed everything. This was not my fault. His rage was not my burden to carry. His debts were not mine to pay. His cruelty was not proof of my weakness. It was proof of his corruption. That realization felt like oxygen rushing into lungs that had been suffocated for years. I remembered every time I had told myself that one day things would get better, that if I obeyed enough, if I gave enough, if I loved enough, maybe he would change. But lying there, I saw those lies for what they were: survival tactics that had kept me alive, but also kept me chained. I thought of my mother's pleading eyes, her insistence that keeping him calm mattered more than protecting me, and I realized she was not my ally. She was too broken, too afraid, too invested in her own version of survival. I thought of Michael, his sneer, as he told me I was destroying the family, and I realized he had become another extension of my father, too comfortable in the shadow of power to ever stand in the light. If I wanted freedom, I would have to stop waiting for someone else to give it to me. I would have to take it for myself. The decision crystallized slowly over those days of recovery, solidifying with each painful sip of broth through a straw. I would never again let my father use me as his bank, his punching bag, his scapegoat. I would take back control of my money, my life, and my voice, even if it was wired shut for the moment. When the nurse handed me discharge papers, I felt like she was also handing me a key. I was free to walk away, free to choose differently. I gathered my belongings, small things that reminded me I was still a person beyond their control. A sweater from a friend, a notebook where I scribbled thoughts, a photograph of myself from happier times. I checked my phone and saw the barrage of messages from my mother urging me to come home, telling me to stop exaggerating, telling me I was breaking her heart. There was one from Michael calling me a selfish traitor, but not a single message of apology from my father, not one word of regret. That absence was its own confirmation. I deleted them all, each swipe a small act of defiance, a declaration that I would not be pulled back. I called a lawyer I had found through a pamphlet at the hospital specializing in domestic violence cases and scheduled a consultation. For the first time, I was not hiding, not covering for him, not minimizing my wounds. I photographed my face, the wires, the swelling, and filed them away as evidence. I wrote down every detail I could remember, every date, every bruise, every debt he had forced me to cover. The more I wrote, the clearer it became that I had been living someone else's story, one where I was cast as the victim without choice. Now I was ready to write my own. When I left the hospital, I did not go back to the house. I went instead to a small apartment. A coworker offered me temporarily a place with peeling paint and noisy neighbors, but also a place without shouting, without fists, without fear. That night, as I lay on the creaky bed, the city lights flickering through the blinds, I felt the ache in my jaw and the weight of my bruises, but beneath it all, I felt something new: strength, determination, hope. My father thought his blow would silence me forever, but in truth, it had awakened me. I was done being the obedient daughter. I was done being the silent victim. From that moment on, I was Claire Thompson, a 30-year-old woman who would no longer be defined by his debts or his violence. I would fight back, not with fists, but with truth, with evidence, with the law, with the will to reclaim my life. In the weeks after I left the hospital, I began to piece together a plan, not with anger as my weapon, but with strategy, careful and deliberate, because I knew the only way to truly defeat a man like my father was to take away the power he had always clung to, the power of money, of intimidation, and of silence. My first step was financial, because money had been the chain around my neck for years. I went to the bank where I had my checking account, one that for years my mother had partial access to under the guise of convenience, and I closed it. The teller raised an eyebrow at the bruises still fading on my face, but I did not explain. I simply asked for a new account in my name. Only no shared access, no links to anyone in my family. I set up alerts on my phone, monitored every transaction, and for the first time felt the relief of knowing my father could not reach into my pocket. With my finances secured, I turned to gathering evidence because I knew stories without proof were too easily dismissed. I collected medical records from the hospital, detailed accounts of the fractures in my jaw, the bruising, the trauma. I photographed everything: my swollen face, the marks on my arms, the faint scars from earlier years of abuse that I had hidden under long sleeves. I scrolled back through old emails and text messages, digging up threats and demands, saving them into a folder labeled Truth. I even retrieved a copy of police call logs from neighbors who had reported noise at our house on nights when his rages were particularly loud. Piece by piece, I was building a wall of evidence that would stand even if he tried to call me a liar. My next step was legal. I sat in the quiet office of a domestic violence attorney named Rebecca, a woman with sharp eyes and a steady voice, and I told her everything. For hours, I poured out the story of my childhood, my stolen wages, the escalating violence the night of the broken jaw. She listened without flinching, taking notes occasionally, asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she leaned forward and said firmly, "Claire, you have grounds for both criminal charges and a restraining order. We can make sure he cannot come near you again, and if he tries, the law will be on your side." The words filled me with cautious hope. I signed papers that day, beginning the process of filing charges for assault and petitioning for a protection order. It felt like planting a flag in the ground, a declaration that I would not be his victim anymore. Beyond the legal system, I sought emotional support, something I had never dared to pursue. I joined a local support group for women who had survived domestic violence, sitting in a circle of strangers who somehow felt like sisters. We shared stories, we cried, we laughed at the absurdity of the lies we had been told to keep us compliant. For the first time, I did not feel alone. I heard women speak about finding love again, about building families of choice, about careers they had reclaimed after years of control, and their courage fed my own. I began therapy as well, learning to untangle the knots of guilt and shame that my father had tied around me. My therapist reminded me again and again that the abuse was not my fault, that survival had been strength, not weakness. Slowly, I began to believe her. As my confidence grew, so did my resolve to protect my future from ever being stolen again. I met with a financial advisor, a kind man named Daniel, who explained how to safeguard my income, how to invest in ways my father could never touch, how to build a foundation that was mine alone. I set up automatic savings, created an emergency fund, and for the first time in my life, the idea of stability felt real. I even looked into moving, finding a modest apartment in a neighborhood where no one knew my father's name, where I could walk the streets without fear of running into him at the corner store. Each step was small on its own, but together they formed a shield. My father, meanwhile, continued his spiral. Through distant relatives, I heard that his gambling debts were mounting, that collectors were hounding him, that he was raging more violently at home. Michael had dropped out of school and was drifting. My mother was exhausted, yet none of them reached out with apologies. Instead, I received messages dripping with manipulation, claiming I was heartless, that I had abandoned them, that family sticks together. I ignored them, each deletion a reminder that I was no longer their puppet. Still, I knew there would come a day when ignoring would not be enough, when they would try to pull me back publicly to shame me into compliance. So I prepared for that too. I printed copies of my evidence, stored them in safe places, gave them to Rebecca for safekeeping. I rehearsed the truth in front of a mirror, speaking words I had once swallowed, words like, "He hit me. He stole from me. He tried to destroy me." The more I spoke them, the less power they had to shame me. I also started to imagine a life beyond survival. I took extra hours at work, saved diligently, and enrolled in evening classes to finish the degree my father had stolen from me years before. Walking into a classroom as a 30-year-old student surrounded by younger faces was intimidating, but it was also liberating. Each lecture, each assignment felt like reclaiming a piece of the life I had been denied. At night, when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me, I reminded myself that every step I took was an act of rebellion against the man who thought he had killed me with one punch. He believed he had silenced me, but in truth, he had pushed me to finally find my voice. The resistance was not loud, not dramatic, but it was intelligent, deliberate, and unstoppable. I was building a fortress brick by brick, not just to keep him out, but to create a place where I could finally be free. Thanksgiving arrived that year with a chill in the air and a heaviness in my chest because I knew my father would use the holiday gathering as his stage, the place where he could rally relatives to his side and paint me as the villain. I debated not going, but my attorney Rebecca encouraged me to stand my ground. She told me that silence allows abusers to control the narrative, but truth spoken in the open can dismantle their power. So I walked into my aunt's house with my head held high, even though my stomach churned with nerves. The living room was crowded with cousins, uncles, and distant relatives I had not seen in months. Conversations hushed the moment I stepped inside. My father stood near the fireplace with a drink in his hand, his voice booming as he declared to anyone who would listen that his eldest daughter had betrayed him, that she refused to help her family, that she was ungrateful and selfish. My mother sat beside him, nodding weakly, while Michael leaned against the wall, smirking at me as though daring me to defend myself. I felt every eye in the room on me, judgment heavy in the air, but I refused to shrink. Instead, I placed a folder on the dining table and spoke, my voice steady though my heart pounded. "If you want the truth," I said, "then you should see what he has done." I opened the folder and spread out photographs, medical records, and copies of police reports. Gasps rippled through the room as relatives leaned forward, their eyes widening at the images of my swollen face, the X-rays of my broken jaw, the doctor's notes describing repeated injuries. "These are not accidents," I continued. "These are the results of years of violence. This is what your beloved Henry does when he does not get his way." My father's face turned red, his hand tightening around his glass until I thought it might shatter. He barked at me to stop, called me a liar, but the evidence lay undeniable in front of everyone. I pointed to the receipts, the bank transfers, the records of money siphoned from my accounts. For decades, he has used me as his personal bank. I said, forcing me to pay for his debts, his gambling, his failures, and when I refused, he tried to destroy me. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the nervous shifting of chairs. An aunt whispered that she had suspected something for years, but had been too afraid to interfere. An uncle muttered that Henry's temper had always been dangerous. My father slammed his glass down, shouting that I was destroying the family's honor. "You are the one who destroyed it," I replied, "when you chose violence over love, when you valued money over your own daughter." Michael stepped forward, then his voice dripping with contempt, as he accused me of exaggerating, of fabricating the story to make myself look like a victim. I looked him in the eye and said quietly, "I covered for you for years. I gave you money for school. I took the beatings so you would not have to, and this is how you repay me." He flinched, but said nothing more. My mother began to cry, pleading with me to stop. But for once, her tears did not sway me. I had spent my life silencing myself for her comfort, and now I was done. I turned to the relatives who stared at me with conflicted expressions and said, "You need to know that enabling abuse is as damaging as delivering it. For years you looked away, you excused his temper, you pretended not to notice the bruises. That silence gave him power, but I will not be silent anymore." My father lunged as if to grab the papers from the table, but two cousins intervened, holding him back as he cursed and thrashed. The sight of him restrained, red-faced and sputtering, contrasted sharply with the calm firmness of my words, and I could see the shift in the room. People who had once defended him now looked at him with suspicion, even disgust. I gathered my papers, sliding them back into the folder, and delivered the final blow. "If you want to stand with him, then you are choosing to stand with violence and lies. I choose truth. I choose freedom. I will not protect him anymore." Then I walked out of the house, leaving behind the stunned silence of relatives grappling with the truth. For the first time in my life, I had spoken openly without fear, without apology, and the power that once belonged to him now belonged to me. In the days following that Thanksgiving confrontation, the ripple effects began to spread in ways I had not fully anticipated. Some relatives reached out quietly, apologizing for their silence, admitting they had seen bruises or heard arguments, but had convinced themselves it was not their place to interfere. Others doubled down in defense of my father, accusing me of exaggeration, insisting that families should handle their problems privately, not air them like dirty laundry in front of outsiders. But the twist came when one of my cousins, a young woman studying journalism, asked if she could share my story more widely. She had taken photos of the documents on the table that day and believed that exposing him publicly was the only way to ensure he could not twist the narrative anymore. At first, I hesitated, afraid of the backlash, afraid of what it would mean to see my pain in print, but then I remembered my father's smirk when he said no one would believe me, and I realized there was no greater revenge than proving him wrong in front of the world. So I agreed on the condition that names be handled carefully and that my evidence be presented with accuracy. Within 2 weeks, an article appeared in a regional paper detailing my account, complete with photographs of my injuries, excerpts from medical records, and financial proof of years of exploitation. The headline was stark and unflinching, painting my father not as a hardworking family man, as he had always portrayed himself, but as a violent abuser and manipulator. The story spread quickly through social media, shared by advocacy groups and survivors of domestic violence who recognized their own experiences in mine. Suddenly, his carefully curated reputation began to unravel. People in town whispered when he walked by former colleagues, distanced themselves, and creditors who had once tolerated his excuses grew harsher in their demands. My brother Michael raged online, posting long screeds about betrayal and family loyalty. But his words only drew more attention to the article, fueling debates that no longer ended in his favor. My mother called me sobbing, blaming me for the humiliation, but I told her firmly that the humiliation belonged to the man who had earned it through his fists and his lies. The ultimate consequence arrived when law enforcement, pressured by public attention and armed with the evidence Rebecca had carefully filed, moved forward with charges. One evening, I received a call from the prosecutor's office informing me that my father had been arrested for felony assault and financial coercion. The image of him being led away in handcuffs was one I never thought I would live to see. Yet, there it was on the evening news, his head bowed, his mouth twisted in anger but powerless at last. The twist that shocked even me came during the preliminary hearing when witnesses I had never expected stepped forward. A neighbor testified that he had often heard screams and crashes coming from our house late at night. A former co-worker admitted he had seen my father brag about controlling his family through fear. Even one of my uncles, who had long defended him, confessed on the stand that he had once witnessed him slap me across the face at a barbecue, but had stayed silent out of fear of causing a rift. Their testimonies painted a picture so undeniable that even the relatives who had resisted believing me began to waver. My father tried to glare at me from across the courtroom, but his eyes held less fire, now more desperation, as if he sensed that the walls of impunity he had built for decades were crumbling. The community that had once respected him now looked at him with contempt, and the man who had boasted of being untouchable was finally facing consequences. For me, the twist was not only his downfall, but the unexpected support that grew around me. Survivors reached out through letters and messages telling me that my courage had inspired them to seek help or to speak out. Advocacy groups invited me to share my story at events to put a face to the statistics that so often felt abstract. At first, I was terrified, but then I realized that speaking was not reopening wounds, it was turning them into weapons of change. Each time I told my story, the shame lessened, the strength grew, and the girl who once cowered in silence became a woman who stood tall. The consequences for my family were harsh. Michael lost friends who wanted nothing to do with someone defending an abuser. My mother withdrew further into herself, refusing to attend hearings, refusing to acknowledge reality, clinging to the fantasy that everything was my fault. But I no longer carried the weight of their choices. I had given them chances to stand with me, and they had chosen him. Now they would live with that choice. The trial ended with a guilty verdict, and my father was sentenced to prison time, along with mandated restitution for the debts he had forced on me. Hearing the judge declare him guilty was a moment I had dreamed of but never believed would come, a moment that tasted like justice. Yet the true consequence was not his imprisonment, but my liberation. For the first time in my life, I walked out of a courthouse not as a victim, not as a daughter defined by her father's rage, but as Claire Thompson, survivor, truth-teller, free woman. The twist that had begun with violence had ended with justice, and the echoes of his spit-laced words, "You are dead to me," had transformed into my own declaration. "No, you are dead to me, and I am alive at last." In the months after the trial, I learned that freedom was not a single moment, but a series of small choices made every day. Choices that slowly rebuilt the life I had been denied. I moved into a modest apartment with pale blue walls that I painted myself a space that smelled of fresh beginnings and not of fear. For the first time, I chose furniture not to please anyone else, but to comfort me. A soft, gray couch, a wooden table where I could write shelves lined with books that reflected my curiosity rather than my father's demands. I returned to school in earnest, walking across campus with my books pressed to my chest, nervous at first among younger students, but gradually proud of myself for pursuing the degree that had been ripped away years earlier. Each lecture felt like reclaiming stolen time. Each exam passed a victory over the lies that I was worthless without him. I worked extra hours to support myself, balancing responsibilities with a determination that surprised even me. My jaw healed, though faint scars remained reminders of pain that once defined me but no longer imprisoned me. In therapy, I learned to let go of the guilt that was never mine to carry, to forgive myself for the years I stayed silent, to see survival as strength rather than shame. Slowly, I began to sleep through the night without waking to imagined shouts. And when I did dream, they were not nightmares of fists, but visions of possibilities. The community that had once whispered now embraced me. Neighbors smiled, colleagues treated me with respect, and advocacy groups invited me to share my story. At first, I trembled at the thought of speaking in public, but when I stood at a podium and told a room full of strangers that I had survived a father's rage and reclaimed my life, I saw heads nod, tears fall, and hands rise in solidarity. And I realized my voice could be a lifeline for others. Each time I spoke, the shame diminished until it vanished, entirely replaced by purpose. I also discovered friendship and even the beginnings of love in places I had never expected. A fellow survivor from the support group became a close friend, someone who understood without explanation the invisible scars we carried, and together we built a bond stronger than blood. Later, slowly, I opened my heart to the idea of romance again, cautiously trusting a man who listened more than he spoke, who treated me with gentleness instead of control, who never once raised his voice to assert dominance. It was strange at first to feel cared for without strings attached, to laugh without fear. But with time, I accepted that I deserved kindness. Financially, I stabilized savings, steadily building a cushion that gave me confidence I had never known. I no longer lived in fear of eviction or dependence, no longer felt the suffocating grip of someone else's control over my livelihood. Independence became my armor. My family remained fractured, my mother still refusing to face the truth, my brother drifting further into bitterness, but I no longer begged for their acceptance. Blood had bound me to pain, but I had learned that family could be chosen, and I chose those who respected me, who loved without condition. The true resolution was not that my father was in prison, though that mattered, but that I had found peace within myself. I had transformed from the girl silenced in a living room of relatives to the woman who walked freely into her own future. One evening, as I sat by the window of my apartment watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold, I whispered aloud the words that had haunted me. "You are dead to me." This time there was no sting, no grief, only release. My life was mine at last, and though the scars remained, they were no longer symbols of defeat, but of survival proof that I had endured, resisted, and won.